This conference will now be recorded.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shanae McPherson. I am the Volunteer Connect 55 Plus Administrator for Orange County Department on Aging. I would like to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our talk on VSED, Voluntary Stopping of Eating and Drinking, a little known end-of-life option. Today's program is sponsored by Orange County Department on Aging and hosted by Project Engage and their senior resource team, the End of Life Choices. I would like to thank Janice Tyler, our director, and all of our Department on Aging staff for your tireless support and participation in all of our events. The End of Life Choices Senior Resource Team's goal has always been to provide support, resources, and educational programs that enable Orange County's older adults and their families the opportunity to make informed decisions on end-of-life care and end-of-life planning. And today's program is no exception. So before we begin, just to go over a few housekeeping rules that most of you have heard. All of the cameras have been turned off. All of the mics have been muted. We encourage everyone to view the presentation today in active cameras mode. So if you look to the center of your screen at the very top, you'll see the words view everyone, and you can select the drop-down arrow and you want to select active cameras. That'll give you a better view of our presenters this afternoon during their presentation. We welcome all questions. If you have a question, we're asking that you please use the chat bubble to submit your questions, and they will all be read at the end of our presentation today during the Q&A session. The chat bubble can be found in the top right corner of your screen. It looks like a little bubble. When you click on it, it will give you the actual text box in the bottom right corner, and you will see the words everyone. What you want to do is select from that drop down arrow again and select Kimberly Knight's name. Kimberly is being gracious enough to collect all of our questions for us this afternoon, so thank you, Kimberly. So she will take all of our questions. This program is also being recorded for future viewing purposes on our department's YouTube page. You can access that YouTube link via our county page at orangecountync.gov. We will also be providing resources and other links at the very end of this program. There'll be a slide that lists all of that information, so you'll have that on the recording should you need to access it at a later point. I have the pleasure of introducing Ann Weston this afternoon. Ann is a resident of Hillsborough and is the founder of the Green Burial Project, a 501c3 dedicated to education and advocacy around the subject of green or natural burials, and is also an active member of our End of Life Choices Senior Resource Team, and will be introducing our speakers this afternoon. So Ann, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Shanae. I cannot tell you how happy I am to introduce the Shaffers to you this afternoon. Elliot Shaffer is a graduate of the University of Michigan Medical School. He was a practicing physician in Media, Pennsylvania, specializing in geriatrics, and was also the medical director of Martin's Run Life Care Community. Susan Schaffer is a graduate of Rutgers Law School. She served as senior litigation counsel for AstraZeneca Pharmaceuticals. And since moving to the Durham area 10 years ago, they have given talks on the subject of VSED, voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, many times throughout the Triangle. If you've heard the Schaffer speak at one of our previous events, you know that you're in for a very rich experience this afternoon. If this is your first time meeting them, hang on for the ride. Welcome to you, Susan and Elliot.
Thank you, Ann. Well, VSED or voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, is one of several end-of-life choices for a competent person with a terminal illness. In 2009, my mother was diagnosed with oral cancer. She received a painful course of radiation and chemotherapy. The treatment was not successful, and she was faced with the final and very painful stages of her disease. I wrote an article about her end-of-life decisions, and I would like to read a portion of it. After Labor Day, we learned that the treatment had not worked. The cancer had spread, and Mom's life expectancy was now measured in months. It was the only time throughout the ordeal that I saw Mom cry. She told me that she was not afraid to die, but she was afraid of the pain and suffering to come. She wanted to be in control of her life and was thinking about whether she could just stop eating, but feared that would be just as painful. I felt torn, wanting to hang on to every remaining minute of her time with us, but understanding her dilemma. I suggested that she discuss her options with my husband, Elliot, a family doctor and geriatrician. Mom and Elliot had a long talk, and Elliot shared information with her about people who forego food and water, that not only do they not experience increased pain or hunger, but in fact, generally these people enjoy a peaceful death with little or no additional suffering. Mom decided that this was the course that she wanted to take, but she was not ready to stop taking nourishment just yet. Once Mom's closest friends and family heard about her prognosis, they all arranged to visit her. She quietly and individually met with her brother and each of her 6 grandchildren. She smiled as her great-grandsons rolled around on her bed. The morning after saying her final goodbyes to her loved ones, Mom quietly informed her daughters that she was ready to stop eating and drinking. Her choice itself was not a surprise, but the timing was a shock. We quickly arranged for one of us or an aide to be with her at all times, expecting her strength to fail precipitously. Each morning, I would approach her apartment with trepidation, wondering how much closer to death Mom had traveled overnight. Amazingly, I found that each day Mom's spirits grew lighter and more peaceful. There was an immediate and dramatic change the day after Mom made her choice. It was as if she realized that she no longer had to struggle, that she had taken control, and she found comfort in that. The stream of friends and family continued, and Mom would doze lightly between visits. She was always cheerful during these visits, nostalgic about her life and relationships, and open to discuss her decision, which almost everyone found somewhat shocking. At the end of the first week, Mom was so comfortable that she wondered out loud, when is something going to happen? We assured her that generally it takes no more than 2 weeks for a body to slip away without food and water. Mom continued to deny feeling any hunger. She did express appreciation for the few sips of water that she took with her pain medication. We soothed her dry mouth with a spray that helped replace saliva, and that seemed to satisfy her. At no time in the days that passed did Mom appear to be suffering. She lived those last days with a tremendous grace that touched everyone who was privileged to spend time with her. We talked about death. She was clearly not afraid. She frequently smiled and acknowledged what a good life she had lived. Mom expressed curiosity about what she would experience after death, and whether she would see her parents or my dad, but then quickly dismissed her curiosity with a cheerful acceptance of her fate. On day 11, Mom became less responsive. On day 12, she peacefully slipped away. Mom taught us much at her life's end, and particularly in those last 12 days. Witnessing her grace, her humor, her wisdom, and her compassion for all whom she touched in the extraordinary circumstances of her passing was an experience that I will never forget. Seeing her take control of her death, much as she had of her life, was empowering to everyone who was with her and who heard of the circumstances of her death. I am so proud to be her daughter. I received more than 200 emails after this article was published in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Almost all of the emails expressed gratitude for the information about VSED. Many were from people with cancer or other terminal illnesses who stated that they had not been aware of this option and planned to speak to their physicians about it. Many were from people who had witnessed the peaceful and undignified death of a friend or a loved one and harbored a strong fear of having to face a similar fate, who now expressed a strong sense of relief that there was another option. A remarkable reaction came from physicians who read the article. Numerous physicians disclosed to us that they had absolutely no idea that this was a practical option at the end of life. From what I have read, my mother's experience is similar to others who have hastened death through the use of VSED. But the process of sharing my mother's story revealed a dramatic lack of information about VSED among both the patient population and the medical community. I have read an interesting fact about VSED. Even in states where physician-assisted suicide is legal, VSED is chosen twice as often. Why? I wondered. I have some ideas about why this might be true. It is a less violent or more gentle way of dying than taking lethal medication. Second, the slower process with VSED permits reconciliation and healing goodbyes with loved ones. But perhaps most importantly is the issue of control. Death by VSED occurs over days. It's an incremental and reversible decision. In other words, the patient has control through the whole process. Control as to whether to initiate VSED, control as to when to initiate VSED, and control as to whether to continue VSED. Interestingly, it is reported that just the knowledge that VSED is an available option often gives a patient that sense of control, even if they never choose to initiate it. Control exists in the knowledge that when life's burdens consistently outweigh its benefits, there is a way to exit gracefully. Many people, like my mother, are not afraid of death, but are afraid of the suffering caused by the progression of a terminal disease. There have been many advances in palliative care in recent years, but it is not a panacea. VSED allows for a more independent and potentially more meaningful death experience for the patient and the family. It is very compatible with dying at home for many reasons, but especially because it is not at all dependent on technology. Practices similar to VSED are not new. In Jainism, an Indian religion that dates back to the 9th century BC, there is a ritual in which a Jain practitioner stops eating and drinking to prepare for death with the intention of purifying the body and removing all thoughts of physical things. That practice is still used, and Hinduism has a similar practice. And now Elliot will discuss the physiology of VSED.
We're just getting arranged here a little bit. So, what is the definition of VSED? Voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. VSED is described as an action of a competent, capacitated person who voluntarily and deliberately chooses to stop eating and drinking with the primary intention to hasten death because unacceptable suffering persists. VSED is distinct from a situation where there is a loss of appetite or thirst that is often a natural part of the dying process. The emphasis in the definition of VSED is that it is intentional. Why would a person choose VSED as an end-of-life option? When the quality of life significantly diminishes, some of us prefer to hasten death, or in other words, not prolong life. This is the same reason that many of us have signed advance directives or living wills. What amounts to a poor quality of life is a very personal decision. For one person, it might be the inability to communicate. For another person, extreme physical suffering, being a burden to loved ones, loss of independence, loss of bodily function, lack of consciousness. But when the burdens of life consistently outweigh all of the benefits, some people are looking for a gentle way to exit life. Susan's mother is an excellent example of a patient for whom VSED is an option that should be available. She was a healthy, vibrant, intelligent, active 88-year-old woman who was diagnosed with metastatic cancer of the jaw. She completed an arduous, painful course of chemo and radiation therapy and found out that it had not worked and there were no other options for a potential cure. She already suffered from a steady but increasing pain that required continuous narcotics and was only going to get worse. And the noticeable mass in her lower right jaw was rapidly growing, and over a couple of months would start to close off her windpipe and make swallowing impossible. And so after meeting with her children, grandchildren, she stopped eating and drinking. The thought of dying in any situation raises questions, fears, and emotional confusion. But the idea of causing death on purpose by starvation and dehydration certainly provokes images of suffering and pain. There are many images associated with dying by starvation and dehydration. TV commercials of small children starving in poor third world countries, people locked away in prison camps, emaciated and suffering. And we can all see the image of a person lost in the hot desert, crawling along in agony with skin and lips parched and cracking. These are some common images associated with dying as a result of starvation and dehydration. Many people, including physicians and professional caregivers, think that VSED would cause significant pain and suffering. It is important to note that these images of dying invariably are about people who are in adverse situations and who do not want to die and are struggling to stay alive. There is a tremendous psychological component to their suffering. In contrast, VSED is used by people who are at the end of their life and have accepted that fact. They have voluntarily chosen to maintain control of their life and dying process. And what clinical experience confirms is that in reality, VSED as a means of hastening death can actually allow a person to die with less pain and suffering. So let's talk briefly now about the physiology of VSED. There are two aspects to VSED: stopping all food, which causes starvation, and stopping all liquids, which causes dehydration. In VSED, death occurs as a result of dehydration. For most people, within 7 to 21 days, but usually less than 2 weeks. This depends on multiple factors, including other illnesses, the strength and state of nutrition and hydration of the individual. Of course, the detailed metabolic description of starvation and dehydration is quite complex, but I will simplify here. When we stop eating, starvation starts to occur. The body initially uses the stored sugars, mainly from the liver and kidneys. These sugar stores are depleted in a day or two, and the body starts to burn fat for energy. The fat is converted into free fatty acids and glycerol. The free fatty acids are converted into ketones, and the glycerol is converted into sugar. Eventually, in the starving person, the body also starts to break down muscle for energy, but this does not happen for a month, and so is not directly relevant to VSED. A few things happen as a result of the ketosis, which develops from the metabolism of the free fatty acids. Number one, the ketosis, possibly in association with the release of endorphins, causes a mild euphoric peaceful state, but the person remains alert. Two, the ketosis suppresses the feeling of hunger. This is one of the reasons that absolutely no food should be eaten. If the person eats even a little food, the ketosis could be reversed and the person will feel hungry all over again. And third, there is a metabolic acidosis that develops. The body becomes mildly acidotic, and to compensate, the respiratory rate increases, but this is not uncomfortable. Now, simultaneously, the body is becoming increasingly dehydrated. Humans lose water continuously through respiration, perspiration, and urination. And the only way to replace the water is to drink. So when we stop drinking, we naturally get progressively more dehydrated. This results in increasing electrolyte imbalance and the accumulation of metabolic breakdown products and toxins. As dehydration increases, there is a progressively increasing lethargy, eventually leading to coma. Organs start to shut down and fail, and ultimately death results from an arrhythmia or irregular heartbeat. The heart stops. There are many descriptions of people using VSED to hasten their death. It is reported that VSED does not cause significant suffering or pain and can actually make the dying process more comfortable. In one study, hospice nurses reported that patients who had died using VSED showed few signs of pain and suffering, 2 on a 10-point scale, and that the quality of their deaths was very good, 8 on a 10-point scale. VSED is a decision made by a competent person in order to gain more control over his or her own dying. There's no permission necessary from doctors or lawyers. There's no waiting period. There's no technology required, but support is important. The information gathered while learning about and discussing VSED offers a sense of confidence and comfort, even if the person decides never to use VSED. This serves as sort of a security blanket, just knowing that the option is there if wanted or needed. Dying is hard work, and thinking about it raises extremely emotional and complicated issues. So coming to the decision to use VSED is a process that should occur over time. It is essential that the person thinking about VSED understands their illness and all of the available options and treatments. It is very difficult to undertake VSED without help. The process begins by discussing end-of-life wishes and concerns with family, appropriate friends, physicians, caregivers, and clergy. A patient should consider writing down thoughts and reasons for choosing this approach. It may help clarify thoughts for oneself, as well as helping others to better understand the patient's reasoning and follow the patient's wishes. It is easy to understand how other people might get confused about someone wanting to starve themselves to death. And so it may be very difficult for family and friends to understand why a patient has made that choice. And therefore, the patient may experience a lack of support or understanding from friends and family, and even from professional healthcare providers and clergy. Many healthcare providers, physicians, and hospice workers simply may have no experience with VSED. People who are going to help a person through this process need to understand VSED, understand the reason for choosing VSED, and be in complete support. It would be quite unsettling for loved ones to start arguing and adding obstacles to the patient during the dying process. Someone who does not understand VSED might think they are making it easier for the patient by suggesting that the patient slowly wean themselves off of food and drink, or by offering food and drink once the process has started. This would just cause more distress by prolonging the process and possibly reversing the ketosis, causing hunger. It's very important that the patient meet with their physician to discuss the illness, issues, values, and wishes, and make sure that the physician understands VSED and is in support and complete agreement with the decision. The patient does not need the physician's permission, but the support is essential. If for any reason the physician cannot support the decision, then it is necessary to ask for a referral to another physician who will support the patient in their choice. Also, the physician must be willing to make a referral for hospice care when appropriate. Finally, it is important to discuss with the hospice organization that you're hiring, that you are planning to use VSED, and make sure that they have the knowledge and willingness and experience to support the plan appropriately. Now let's talk about some of the problems that could occur and what can be done to prevent and mitigate the distress. As you might expect, many people report thirst and hunger. Although these complaints usually resolve in a day or two, and elderly people often have a decreased or absent sensation of thirst. It is important to distinguish the sensation of thirst from having a dry mouth. The dry mouth that might persist can be alleviated with moisturizing sprays and swabs. Excellent oral care is extremely important. Lip balm should be used to prevent cracking of the lips, and oral hygiene and teeth cleaning should be continued. In addition to excellent oral care, general palliative care is essential. Physical pain associated with any underlying illnesses needs to be aggressively treated with pain medications. Generally, these are narcotics, and so the involvement of a physician well-versed in pain management is essential. And of course, the hospice workers themselves are trained to evaluate and treat pain. It's also very important to review the medications that you are currently taking with your own doctor and reevaluate the need and value of continuing or stopping each of your current medications. So also, it is okay to continue useful medications and take them with a sip of water if needed. Additional supportive and palliative care is also essential and should be provided by the support team, usually in hospice at this point, but may include family and friends. This care, of course, needs to be individualized, but such things as regular turning and repositioning, skin care, bathing, bowel care, and attending to requests of the dying person to improve comfort. Support for the dying person is an integral part of the dying process, and arrangements for this 24-hour care should be made before the patient begins VSED. Hospice is usually very good in helping getting things organized and providing support, although they may not be knowledgeable about VSED. Another good resource is Compassion and Choices, which is an organization extremely knowledgeable about VSED and able to help with setting up support and care, and also be able to assist with any issues that arise during the dying process. If the patient is in a nursing home, there may be additional complications that arise from the nursing home rules and regulations, especially the Medicare regulations regarding hydration and nutrition. Another area of potential complications in the nursing home is the use of multiple caregivers on different shifts. It is difficult to assure that all the caregivers understand and completely support the choice of VSED. It is important that the nursing home really understands the intentions of the patient and is willing to support this option. If any doubt exists, it might be preferable for the patient to move back to their own or a family member's home to die. This end-of-life option requires a determined and well-informed individual with significant support in order to assure success. This option of VSED is not for everyone. For some, choosing the date to initiate VSED that will result in death requires more self-control and determination than they possess. And for others who are not able to gather sufficient support, this option is very difficult and may not be feasible. But for people who want to die as they lived, making personal decisions regarding important questions in their lives with consultations from trusted healthcare professionals, family, friends, and clergy, VSED is an important option to know about. And now Susan will discuss the legal and ethical issues regarding VSED.
When a patient like my mother begins to consider ways of hastening her death to avoid suffering, they may have 3 or 4 legal options. 1, physician-assisted suicide, or as some call it, aid in dying, where it is legally available through lethal prescription. Right now, it's available in 10 states or districts, including the state of Washington, Oregon, Vermont, California, Colorado, Montana, District of Columbia, Maine, New Jersey, and Hawaii. But most, if not all of these, have a 6-month residency requirement prior to authorization of physician-assisted suicide. The second option is the administration of large doses of opioids or sedatives as prescribed by a doctor in the case of intractable pain or anxiety in order to treat the pain or anxiety, but which may have the double effect of leading to unconsciousness and hastening death. The third option is patient refusal of treatment if one is dependent on sustaining medical treatment such as a ventilator or artificial hydration or nutrition. And the fourth option is VSED, voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. Depending on the circumstances or where a patient resides, they may very well be advised by their physician about the first 3 choices, but probably will not be informed about the fourth choice, VSED. Why is this? Well, it's possibly because of lack of knowledge or misperceptions on the part of the medical community of the biological facts underlying VSED. It's also possibly because of uncertainty in the medical community about the legality of VSED. And thirdly, perhaps uncertainty in the medical community about the ethics of VSED. Today, we hope to address all 3 of these concerns. We were unable to find any empirical studies evaluating awareness or knowledge of VSED as an end-of-life option among healthcare providers or the general public. In a 2008 article about end-of-life options, Dr. Timothy Quill noted that there are no reliable data about the frequency of voluntary stopping of eating and drinking in the United States, although the practice is still thought to be rare. Our anecdotal experience has indicated that both patients and providers are often unaware of this option, or there are many misconceptions concerning it. In our personal experience, even hospice nurses displayed a complete lack of knowledge of the practicalities of VSED and seemed a little freaked out by my mother's choice. However, in the 11 years since my mother's death, it appears that hospice organizations are beginning to recognize that this is an area that has not been adequately understood and considered, but it still remains to be seen the extent to which any particular hospice actively supports it. I would like to go over the legal analysis of VSED. VSED is legal in all 50 states, but by that I mean that there is not one court case or piece of legislation making it illegal, but in most jurisdictions there's just no law at all regarding VSED. This has led to legal uncertainties on behalf of medical professionals and caregivers. These perceived legal uncertainties may lead healthcare providers to undermine a patient's decision to stop eating and drinking, or even more likely, to not even inform appropriate patients that this option exists. The few cases that do exist in the case law support a patient's right to self-determination in choosing VSED by analogizing it to the well-established right to refuse medical treatment, or even characterizing VSED as a direct exercise of a patient's right to refuse medical treatment. And courts have consistently held that any kind of force feeding would be a legal battery and therefore impermissible. But what about the concern that VSED is suicide and that a physician might be risking criminal or civil liability for assisted suicide in informing a patient about VSED or supporting a patient that has chosen VSED? Well, first of all, suicide is not a crime in any US state. But more importantly, VSED is not suicide. The human body naturally loses fluids, and choosing VSED is simply electing not to interfere with this dehydration process. Assisted suicide is a crime in most states, but coincidentally not in North Carolina. But even in states where it is a crime, if VSED is not suicide, then informing a patient about VSED or supporting a patient that has chosen VSED is not assisted suicide. Moreover, all states which recognize the crime of assisted suicide require an active step, such as providing a toxic agent, in comparison with a passive act or omission. Neither honoring a patient's decision to refuse nourishment nor providing information about VSED would be the type of active step envisioned by these statutes. The active versus passive or act versus omission distinction was endorsed by the US Supreme Court in 2 cases in 1997. This analysis demonstrates that there is no legal basis for a healthcare provider to withhold information about VSED from patients because there is no reasonable fear of legal liability on the part of the healthcare provider. But what if a physician is morally opposed to VSED? A physician is not required to affirmatively assist a patient who has chosen an option to which the physician has moral objections. But a physician is ethically required to honor a patient's refusal to receive any treatment, including force feeding. Therefore, such a physician is ethically obligated to refer such a patient to another physician. The ethical analysis is similar to abortion, in which a physician is ethically required to inform a patient about the option of abortion, but is not required to perform the procedure if they have moral objections. Such a physician is, however, ethically required to make an appropriate referral for such a patient or be ethically guilty of abandoning the patient. In summary, healthcare providers' concerns about the legality or ethics of VSED are misplaced. They not only may, but they should honor patients' requests about VSED, and furthermore, they should educate patients about this option. Now, before we take questions, we wanted to mention that we have a bibliography of the sources that we use to prepare this talk. And Shanae will be posting it on the website. But also, since the time when we first began giving this talk, there are many, many more articles and also podcasts available on the internet if you Google voluntary stopping of eating and drinking.
Okay, we're back.
Well, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I definitely learned a lot of informative information. And everyone at this time, you're welcome to open your cameras. And we're going to take question and answer time now. So we had a question in the chat box. We're going to start there with what options, if any, are available for someone with dementia?
That question never fails to come up. As we mentioned, the VSED is an option for a competent person. Dementia is a tricky issue because there are many stages of dementia. And early in dementia, if a person was very concerned about not wanting to live with this condition, a person would still have the competence to make this choice, but it would have to be made fairly early. We actually do, we actually do have experience with a friend and a patient of Elliot's who chose VSED because of several comorbidities, but happened to be in a stage of early dementia when she made her decision. And as a result, when she would sleep each night, she would get up in the morning and ask for food or fluid because she had forgotten that she had made the choice. So each morning her children would say, you may have it, of course, but if you recall, you had decided to stop eating and drinking in order to die. Do you still want to do this? And she was adamant that she still very much wanted to do it. But ironically, it was a choice that she had to make each day when she woke up.
Thank you so much for that. We also have a viewer highly recommend the work and research and advocacy on VSED of Dr. Stanley Terman, of caring advocates, especially in his work and position on VSED for our loved ones with Alzheimer's disease who prior to onset well documented their choice. So that was a comment from one of our viewers. And then we
that's still a little bit controversial. People are working on that, but at this point in time, I think it's still controversial.
Gotcha. And does the Catholic Church not object to VSED as a mortal sin, which in turn makes it difficult for physicians and nurse practitioners employed at Catholic-owned hospitals to advise patients on VSED without violating terms of employment? Doesn't the church treat VSED as a type of suicide?
As I mentioned when I wrote my article, almost all of the letters that I received were positive. I received of hundreds of letters. 4 of them were negative, and they were all from Catholic priests or practitioners. So I think that's accurate.
Okay. All right, let's see if we have any more here. Okay, let's see. We had a comment. This question may highlight the importance of advanced directives while fully competent. And then our last question up here is, if a patient wants to refer his or her physician to learn more about VSED, is Compassion and Choices the best resource to suggest?
Yes, that's a very good site, and there are really a number of articles now available, to search for on the internet. There is really a lot available now. In terms of the advanced directive, one thing that might be useful is if you're going to, use VSED. Some people have recommended actually doing a video as part of your advanced directive, sort of stating your intention, so that when you become unconscious, there can be no, kind of question about your motivation.
Okay, thank you for adding that. That's all the questions I have in the chat box, but I do welcome everyone to, if you have a question, please let us know, raise your hand, and we can unmute you.
So just one story that making sure when you're thinking about VSED and getting information, there are still people who, there are a lot of people who don't have any experience with VSED, and therefore, emotional bias comes into play quite a lot. So when talking about it, it's very important to actually find out from people, especially your care providers, whether they have real experience working with VSED or whether it's sort of book learning, whether they just have read about it or just rumors. So we've had some experience with people who have gotten into trouble really because of misinformation provided by the care providers. So one really needs to make sure that the care people are supported.
Hi, Ed.
Hi. One question for you both, if I may. We on our website, Dynamite North Carolina, we have posted an advanced directive for dementia, which calls for the implementation of VSED at the right moment. Along the lines, Elliot's point about adding a video is absolutely essential, brilliant idea, brilliant addition. But my question is a little bit different. VSED takes place, and Susan, you made this point that it's not specifically legal in any state, but it's definitely not illegal in any state. It's in this sort of gray amorphous area. And one of the issues I've always had is we have so little data about VSED. We don't know how many people use it and how long it takes on average. And wouldn't it be great if we could get some data to support the excellent points that you both have made? I think it just would be very supportive if we could get data. And one of the differences between VSED and, say, medical aid and dying in the 10 states you mentioned is at least in 9 of those 10 states, there are very detailed and granular reporting requirements. So we have a lot of data, how it works, how long it takes, what dosage to. Wouldn't you? So my question to you is sort of a general question. I'm sure you would like to have data. Do you see any way of getting data reported without making the legal requirement that people report it to the Department of Health and Human Services? Do you see any way we can start getting data? That's my question.
I don't see any way. As you say, the reason you have data with medical aid and dying is because it's a legal requirement. Dying is kind of a private thing. And I can't envision that. Although, Ed, maybe you'll come up with something.
I wish I could. I think you two would. I think you two are, you know more about VSED than anybody in the state and maybe in the country, as far as I know. And you make such a great team. So if you come up with something, it just would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. We don't collect data, but we are starting to collect anecdotal experiences, partly because you refer people to us.
Of course.
And we try to check back with them afterwards, with their family members, not with them, obviously, in order to get details of how the experience was, both for the patient and for the family.
Right.
But
yeah,
Can
I
I-
mean, we do, the main thing, our main source of data is really the stories. And, you know, interestingly, so far, the stories have been really remarkably consistent in the fact that it, you know, it is a gentle, painless way to end one's life. And to the extent that there are complications, they have been related to ongoing illnesses, anxiety, you know, pain problems, you know, things that are just comorbidities that people are suffering from, which provide some complications. So how to manage the comorbidities during VSED would be also quite an interesting idea of, you know, of detailing more.
actually, my favorite report back is related to an email that I received 2 years ago. And it was from a gentleman who happened to be a hospital chaplain. And he told me that his aunt had recently died in her 90s, and she had chosen VSED, and she had a very good death. And he said after her death, we were cleaning up her room, and we found your article in her night table. And I remembered that I had received one of the 200 letters was from a woman that said, I'm in my 80s, but I'm healthy, but I'm going to put this away where I can find it if and when I do need it. So, and the report back was that she had a very good death. So,
Could I just also add something for everybody that's here? So I have a nonprofit, and we're trying to get medical aid in dying passed, and Susan mentioned that it's legal in 10 jurisdictions. I want to point out that even in those 10 jurisdictions, first of all, in the other 40 jurisdictions, you know, VSED it may be the only option, but even in the 10 jurisdictions where medical aid in dying is available, VSED sometimes is the only practical option, because it's hard to find 2 doctors that will prescribe. You have to you have to have a 6 months lifespan, as opposed to with VSED, you might just be suffering from an intolerable and incurable illness. And so VSED will, no matter what happens to medical aid in dying, VSED will always be a necessary option. And the other thing I would like to add, Susan and Elliot, just so you know that you're doing God's work, I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to in this state that call me up and they're desperate because either they or a loved one is suffering from a horrible, interminable illness, and they don't know what to do. And I say, listen, in North Carolina, we don't have medical aid in dying, and you're not going to be able to move to Oregon or Maine and set up residency in time. There is this thing called VSED, and I can't tell you how many times just knowing that that is an option to interminable, endless suffering, just knowing that that's an option relieves them of so much of the burden and the oppression of suffering. Just having it there, just knowing there is something I can do for myself or my loved one. So I thank you so much for your evangelicism of spreading this word, because it's really important. It does bring a lot of comfort to a lot of people in this state.
thank you, Ed.
Thank you for the comments. We have another comment. I'd like to ask them to tell a specific story. So I didn't know if there would be some additional stories you want to share about VSED, or if the examples we just made were good.
Well, I have 2 stories. One is a sort of I guess a complication is I was working with an elderly lady who was using VSED and dying, and we went through the instructions, and the family came to me a while later and said nothing's happening. And we went through the whole thing, and she was using little ice chips as moisturizers instead of the biotin. So she was getting enough ice chips that she was, reversing the dehydration, and so she really wasn't progressing. So just simply noticing that she was using the ice chips and changing that, solved the problem. So there are little details that are really important. The same is true with medication, being able to cut back on most of your medication and maybe just being able to take a sip of water with a pill is not going to interfere, as long as it's really just a sip.
And there's also patches that one can take many pain meds through patches.
So there's one cute story, which I'm going to have Susan tell about her mother and coffee.
Well, as we said, pretty much the recommendation is that there be no food and no fluid, with the occasional sip of water from to take medication. My mother, on about day 5, all of a sudden said, "I would love a cup of coffee." And we were like, has she changed her mind? Like, what's going on?
What do we do?
So we said, decaf or regular? And she said, I suppose I should have decaf. So we went and we made her a cup of coffee, and we brought it in. Again, it was her choice. We weren't imposing this on her. So this choice of dying. So we brought it in. She had one sip. She said, that is the best coffee I've ever had. Meanwhile, it was really stale from the back of her freezer, but she enjoyed the 2 sips. She put it down, and that was the end of it. So you have to, I think, recognize that if you're the helper, that it's not your death. But at the same time, you might say, well, if you really want to sip, that's okay. But, in order for this to progress, it's important that you not have food or fluid. So it's a balance. But as I said, and you might want to warn the person that if you have much fluid, it really could prolong your life. And I assume that's not what you want. But then in the end, it's the person's choice.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Sue, you have a comment? Let me unmute you.
I have a question. What about the use? Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. What about the use of distilled alcohol during the dying process? Does that count as liquid? I mean, if somebody, wanted to have a small drink to calm themselves down, or to, whatever, if they weren't taking pain pills, but they wanted to have, is there any consensus on that, whether that counts as a liquid?
Alcohol has water in it, and it's still a liquid, so it would still, provide liquid, to keep your system going. If you're really going through VSED, the idea is to not take liquid, to, move things along as expeditiously as possible. And, anxiety is, probably not uncommon, and probably better for any medication to be able to use something that doesn't entail adding extra liquid, pills.
Okay.
Even though mainly, often they're not kind of desirable during your normal lifetime.
Also, I don't know about this, but wouldn't it be hard to predict what impact alcohol would have if you had no food or water in your system? So it might be a bit unpredictable.
Yes, that's what I was thinking as well. Thank you for that. We had a comment of, please repeat the name of the mouth spray. The mouth spray.
Biotine.
IoT.
It's available in multiple forms and over the counter in pharmacies and Target, all those stores.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Please feel free to raise your hand or open your camera so I can see. All right, I think we have concluded all our questions in the chat box. Oh, Sue, there you go. Okay, let's see. I unmute you, I'm sorry. I don't think it unmuted you this time.
Okay.
There you go.
I just wondered where, how to contact you if I wanted to get more information. I'm
Susan,
partially
I'll be
attending.
providing that contact information at the end of the presentation. So it'll show up on the screen in just a few minutes.
Okay. All right.
At the bottom of the bibliography that Shanae is going to provide, our contact information is there.
Awesome. Shanae, I think we have concluded our Q&A session. Are there any last minute questions or comments? Oh, I have one come in. Why is there no mention of Final Exit Network, the national organization that provides educational support to terminally ill patients in all 50 states, regardless of aid and dying legislation? I just had that comment come in.
We don't know about that. We'll look it up.
Well, I've heard of Final Exit, and they're not, I mean, them and also Compassion and Choices is the main organization that we have been in touch with. Actually, Compassion and Choices used to, and Ed can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Compassion and Choices used to be known as the Hemlock Society. Is that right, Ed? And Compassion and Choices is very much advocating for medical aid in dying, as well as VSED. Their goal is to have as many choices available for patients at the end of life as possible.
If I could just maybe fill in just quickly to respond to Susan's comment. So many, many years ago, there was an organization called the Hemlock Society, which was started by a gentleman called Derek Humphreys. He wrote a couple of books about the right to die. And then many years ago, that organization split into two. One became Compassion and Choices, which, as Susan just pointed out, advocates for passage of medical aid and dying laws in states. But then the other half became the Final Exit Network. And Final Exit Network, their approach is, well, it's going to take a while to get these laws passed in all these states. And meanwhile, there are a lot of people that are suffering intolerably. And we are going to provide an option for them to end their life peacefully on their own terms now. It's a little bit under the radar screen because it's not necessarily legal or it's not necessarily illegal. But what I would say about Final Exit, which is very interesting, is that they have come up with what they call a SAD, a Supplemental Advance Directive for Dementia. And in this SAD, they specifically say that you can amplify your existing advance directive to say that should you come down, be diagnosed with a case of dementia, then you can opt for VSED at that point, okay? And then, the problem with VSED when you have dementia is that very often, if you introduce a spoon of applesauce to somebody that's suffering from dementia, but that has signed an advance directive saying, I don't want to continue, that person will impulsively, reflexively look like they want the applesauce. And the question's always been, well, which person trumps the other? Is it the current person that's suffering from dementia that seems to want the applesauce, or is it the earlier person that signed that advance directive? Well, the Supplemental Advance Directive for Dementia, which Final Exit has adopted, says it's the earlier person that says when they are mentally competent, says, I do not want to continue if I have dementia. I want to undergo VSED. If it seems like I want nutrition or hydration, that is no longer the true me, and you must respect that. And then it goes even further that Final Exit Legal Department has said that if you, any of us, write this Supplemental Advance Directive for Dementia, and enforcement is refused by an establishment, a hospital, a hospice facility, a nursing home, whatever, Final Exit will undertake the legal defense of that advance directive. So they have adopted VSED as the only option for people with advanced dementia in this country, unfortunately. I mean, unfortunate that it's the only option, not unfortunate that VSED is the option.
I also know that there are groups that are trying to work on form language for other form language for VSED, and try it in the courts for its enforceability.
Sure.
Thank you so much, everyone, for those comments. Do we have any more questions or comments? All right, thank you. And Shanae, I think we are done with our comments and questions portion now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So you'll see here on the screen the annotated bibliography here. It should give you some more information, everyone.
So is that available on the website so a person could print it out?
We can post it.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So I just want to, I'm going to leave this up so that everyone can see it. It's also being recorded. I want to take a moment to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you gained some valuable information that you can take with you. I want to thank the Schaffers, Elliot and Susan. Thank you so much for presenting for us again. And I want to thank Ann Weston. Thank you for introducing our presenters this afternoon. So thank you all. And we hope to see you again at our next event.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a bunch, folks. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.